My name is Craig Kahlke from Cornell Cooperative Extension's Lake Ontario Fruit Team. Welcome to your virtual thinning meeting in the 8 to 12 millimeter window. I know that is kind of past for some folks inland, but we think we'll catch it. Most of you folks that are closer to the lake, and then have varieties that are a little bit later. We're also going to have post-petal fall pest and disease and management recommendations from Janet Van Zoeren. The agenda is there.
All right, great. So yeah, I'm gonna just talk through a few insects and diseases in this post-petal fall timing. And there's a lot to get through and not a lot of time, so I'm gonna move right into it. So fire blight is of course a big one on everybody's minds, especially right now as the thunderstorm rolls through. So really the message here is don't let up yet. Even as we're reaching petal fall, past petal fall in some blocks, a lot of blocks even at petal fall still have a few sort of rat-tailed bloom flowers on the trees. And even if not, I think the last few years, what they've really showed us is that even after bloom is over, fire blight season isn't over. So this is really the big first infection that we've had so far this year. We had a really nice cool spring, and we really didn't accumulate enough degree hours to get a fire blight infection until just the past week or so. So this is really the big timing to be getting out there with your strep, get out there with some kasugamycin, oxytetracycline, or if you feel good about it, if you have a block that hasn't had a lot of pressure in the past and you feel confident that you're past petal fall, then think about some of those biologicals, but definitely make sure that you're not letting up yet with the fire blight season. Moving in just a couple insects, plum curculio is of course the big one on folks' minds right now. So we're sticking that in that petal fall spray and also in a first cover spray. This is just a reminder of some of those products, a lot more, and these are of course all listed in the guidelines. Hopefully you all have the tree fruit guideline from Cornell available. But just a quick reminder about how to use the model if you're thinking about going into NUA, to use the model to figure out how long to spray for into the spring. So this is kind of a lot of information here, but basically what we're seeing is I use May 17th as an example, petal fall spray, when you got that first spray on for plum curculio based on just some of the growers that I've spoken with. So we're calling that 0 degree day. In NUA, you'd be setting that as your biofix. So then let's say that you're spraying something that has a residual of 10 days. Your second spray timing, your first cover would be going in there around May 27th. And using the NUA forecast, if I stick May 17th as that biofix and forecast forward to the 27th, it looks like across the region will be at about 108 degree days. And so as a reminder, you're going to be spraying for plum curculio up until the point where you reach 308 degree days past that biofix of your petal fall spray. So of course, we basically always end up putting on a first cover, but 180 is quite a bit of that 308. It's moving pretty fast because of the heat we've been having. So if things stay hot, I would guess that the plum curculio season, the time when they're entering the orchards, might be over after that first cover, and you might not have to put on a second cover for them, but stay tuned, watch the newsletters, and check NUA to find out that for yourself. Moving forward, even further, talking about the worm spray. So this is basically, we're thinking about the internal lepidopterans, the codling moth, and the OFM. So just as a reminder, this is a slide diagram that I took from Art Agnello. So I'm guessing that a lot of you guys have seen this before. Basically, the reminder here is that we have the flight. This is that green time here. So this is, oops, sorry. This is when the moths would be flying. This is when you're trapping them in the orchard. And then you know that, again, using NUA or just kind of watching the weather and the temperatures, you know that after that flight begins is when they're going to start laying eggs. The eggs require a certain number of heat units to hatch. And you're really trying to time your spraying when the larvae are active. So if you were to spray here during the egg laying period, if you're using Ryman, that's great. But if you're using any of the other products which are larvicides, you're really not getting any management at all. So if we take that into this year, here we have the flight for oriental fruit moth. This is obviously a lot more clunky because it's not just one single graph, but you can see that we're kind of nearing the top of that peak of the oriental fruit moth flight. So that means that if I was to put this into NUA, which I did this morning, the proper timing, the ideal timing for oriental fruit moth for caterpillars is just about right now. Now, the caveat on that is that even though we're catching quite a few oriental fruit moths in the traps, historically looking at larvae in the apples, we really mostly almost I would say like 90% of the larvae in the fruit, based on the fruit that I've looked at, end up being codling moths. So I have a feeling the codling moth is really the pest that should be driving your spray schedule. So if we click over here to codling moth flight, we see that it really just began. We set the biofix basically for like May 17th or something like that. And so the proper timing for your spray to get the codling moth larvae is going to be way out here in the future, probably sometime next week. So if you're out there with your codling moth larvicides right now, it's really not doing anything to catch this particular pest. So just a kind of a reminder of how those work. So that was a really, really quick overview. I don't have a lot of time, so I really just wanted to finish up by saying that we have a lot of information available to you guys this year, and to highlight a few of those. So first, we have the Twilight Meeting series. We had the first one last month, was in the Appleshed in Wayne County. We have 3 more coming up. They're the last Thursday of every month. So we have one coming up next week at Coulter Farms in Lockport. And then we have 2 more, one in June in Penn Yan, one in July in Oswego County. And this information is all provided through all of our listservs. So hopefully you're following that and you're getting this information, and we hope to see you guys there. We also have a bonus bilingual worker training Twilight Meeting, which will be held on Wednesday next week, May 29th. That'll be at Orcharddale Fruit Farms. There's no DEC credits available for that one. Really, the idea of that is to get your workers there, both any of the folks who speak English or Spanish who are working for you, who maybe want a little brush up on IPM techniques, on identifying some of the pests, on how to use proper pesticide safety techniques, all of that kind of thing. Just a quick brush up on all of that. And it'll also just be a lot of fun because we're providing some food and sort of having a little bit of an opportunity to get to know folks from other farms. We also have the New York Tree Fruit Pest Monitoring Network. This is really being spearheaded by Anna Wallace. And this information is all available. You can click on this link here on the screen, and that will take you to the website, and then you can subscribe to her blog. And basically we're trapping across the region, across the state. We have folks trapping in all of these locations that you can see in the map here, and then that information is going to be posted on the blog, so you'll get updates every week of where we're catching what and that kind of thing. So hopefully that will be useful for you. Fine. 2 more things. We have Carrot Cox's lab is putting out this disease forecasting blog. He's been doing this all spring, and every week on Sunday, I believe, he updates it. So similarly, you can click on the link and you can sign up to receive that in your email, or you can just click over there every Monday morning and check out what he's seeing in terms of fire blight and scab infection risks for the week. So this is super helpful. It's for the whole state, but if you kind of move forwards in the video or scroll down on if you're reading it, there's a section for Western New York. And then finally, the Scaffolds podcast has been going on. I think this is the 2nd year now. This is Monique Rivera's sort of reworking of Art Scaffolds newsletter. It's now a podcast form, and there's a lot of information in there. So I do recommend that you all check that out. They put that out, I believe it's every Wednesday. And that's all that I've got for you.
Thank you, Janet. That was perfect on the 7 minutes. So in the interest of time, if you have questions for Janet, if you can put them in the chat box, that would be great. And we might have a few minutes at the end if you wanted to unmute yourself. So I'm going to start with a little bit of crop and phenology update from Niagara County. I've been in quite a few orchards most of the day yesterday and this morning. I'll kind of start with the varieties first and overall. Talk to some growers as well. I've talked to some growers in Orleans County. We also had Liz in Orleans County looking at some orchards and taking some fruitlet measurements. Overall, Honeycrisp is really good. And despite the fact that not everybody can have an on year, I really didn't see any frost damage, didn't yet see any blocks overall that were very light with Honeycrisp. So that's a good thing. Macintosh, the same thing. A few spots at the bottom of hills and inland sites that maybe had not a lot of fruit at the bottoms, but they still had good crops. Gala seems to be a puzzling one. A lot of variation, kind of like all or nothing. Some of the blocks that I was in were loaded from top to bottom. Definitely needed heavy thinning at all stages. A lot of them had 3, 4, or 5 fruit per cluster. And then you can be in a block that is the same latitude, had the same low temperatures, and there's hardly any fruit. I think part of it is some of the blocks I talked to some growers, they were really, really strong crops last year, and maybe they didn't come back quite as strong. Maybe the trees, the stress from all the up and down weather that we've been having, that's the new norm now. That could be part of it, but Gala was definitely all over the board. I find some blocks that were really bad and some blocks that were really good, and a few blocks in between. New York 1, same thing. There's some blocks that are really strong, loaded with clusters, 3, 4, 5 fruit per cluster, top to bottom of the tree. Some places, some colder spots, side of a hill, bottom of a hill, lighter, especially on the bottoms of the trees. A block here and there that was not very good, but overall, I think more better blocks than bad blocks for New York 1. New York 2, one of those early to break bud and early to bloom. Definitely light on the New York 2. I did see one block that was pretty good, close to the lake. And then I saw 3 or 4 blocks that were not good. And talking to growers, a lot of light. So the frost damage, I think, really took care of those. So Ruby Frost is going to be light. Fuji is another one that seems all over the board. I know it's biennial. It could have been an off year for some to begin with, but you can definitely see frost damage in some blocks. I've been in some blocks where there's absolutely no fruit on the bottom of the tree. And then I was in a block about 2 miles from the lake that was loaded. Empires, I did hear from folks in last time in Wayne County. We'll get another update from Wayne County from Jim and Vaughn and Mario today. But Empires seem to have been bad in Wayne County from what we heard last time on our last thinning meeting about 9 days ago. Most of the blocks that I looked at in inland Niagara and close to the lake were good. There's a few that had some spotty trees or not a lot of fruit in the bottom of the tree, but the crop looked good overall. Cortland seemed to have taken it in the chin for most folks. There were a block or 2 that were good or part of a block, but there's also a lot of parts of these blocks that are not good, and there's a lot of blank trees in there. Zestar, another early bud break variety that was far advanced when we had those freezes on April 25th and 26th. I just looked at one block, and that was not a good block. Ginger Gold, the same thing for what it's worth. I know folks are pushing out Ginger Gold. I was in 3 Ginger Gold blocks, and it was not a lot of fruit to be found. Golden Delicious, same thing, the one block that I looked in. Red Delicious, if you were inland, some blocks I can't find a piece of fruit in. Other blocks are very, very light. And then I found a couple of blocks close to the lake that had, I would say, average crops. And some of the growers said they were strong last year. So that could be part of it why they didn't come back completely full. Now you can see some low spots. There's definitely not fruit and as much fruit on the bottom of the tree. Crispin, Jonah Gold, I looked at one block each inland, very, very light. Wild Twist, one block I looked at had a pretty good crop. There were some spots in the bottoms of the trees that didn't have a ton of fruit, but overall good. And some of the growers I talked to said they were good. Sweet Tango, Minnesota 1914, look pretty good for the most part. Evercrisp, depends on where you were. I saw some blocks that were good and some blocks that were not good. Ida Red, the same thing. Some inland Ida Red blocks, very, very light. And some ones closer to the lake look really good. As far as fruit size, let's see if I can get this to pop up on the screen for folks. So these are all the blocks I averaged. Gala, I looked at 11 blocks. So the fruit size averaged between 8 and 13 millimeters. And this was yesterday and today, so they could be slightly bigger from the yesterday fruit. More like 6 to 11 along the lake. Honeycrisp between 9 and 12, more like 7 to 11 along the lake. The New York 1 between 8 and 12, New York 2, 8.5 and 13, more higher in the 11, 12, 13 range. Fuji there, 8.5 to 10. Empire, 8.5 to 15, depending on where you were. The Mac block that I looked had big fruit. The Red Delicious Lake blocks were about 7 or 8 millimeters. Ida Red, far advanced as you would imagine, 13 to 20, average of about 17 inland, and more like an average of about 10 from around the lake. So that's all I got, and I will turn it over to Mario now to give his perspective and the places that he's been. Yep, good.
Okay, so what I tried to do for the amount of time that I had, so on Monday when we had the Petal fall meeting, I evaluated more sites, 39 blocks, 10 lake sites in Wayne County. So today I just went to see the inland sites to understand the situation. So those 29 sites that I visited for the Petal Fall, I visited 26 sites today. Okay, and it's very amazing what I found today, and it's better than what I saw on Monday the 13th. I think I was perhaps more pessimistic than Gingerich and Vaughn on Monday the 13th when we had the last meeting. Starting because if you see either red, I found in that site, for example, at least 1 or 2 fruitlet per clusters that they were growing. And that situation will happen in at least 50% of all the cluster per tree in that particular block. So I tried to write the notes by describing that kind of situation with crisping. Also, I thought I had less fruit, but we had 2 or 3 fruit per cluster in at least 40 or 50% of all those clusters in those trees. AC Mac, the same situation, 1 or 2 fruit per cluster in 40%. In Gela, 2 or 3 fruit per cluster in only 30% of all those clusters per tree. In Rome, I cannot understand. Rome was blooming the day that we had the meeting on Monday, May 13. When I went to this block again, I saw very few fruitlet growing, a low set, a poor growth, very small separation. I cannot understand that situation of that Rome block. Empire, I found 2, 3 fruit in 40% of all those clusters. Evercrisp in this particular farm was pretty bad. Only 1 or 2 fruit per cluster, and only 20% of all those clusters per tree. If you see a farm 2, it's a Gela that is already over thin. I don't know if the grower already put the spray or no, but it was over thin in my opinion. Honeycrisp at that particular site was better than Gela and had 2 or 3 fruitlet per cluster in 40 or 45% of all those clusters. AC Mac, if you see there in my red note, is no fruit at the tops. That Fuji in that particular block had only 1 or 2 fruit per cluster in only 30% of all the cluster per tree. Macau, I see 2 or 3 fruit per clusters. I saw a honeycrisp block with at least 70 to 70 fruit per tree today. 2, 3 fruit in 60% of the cluster per tree. Empire, I found an Empire with 50 to 60, and New York 2. It's no good, only 20, 30% of crop potential by today. And on Fuji and Cortland at the bottom, even though I found Fuji fruitlets there, most are 8 to 10, or some of them are 10 to 12. I would say that it's no crop at that particular site. I already saw excessive shoot growth of 8 to 10 inches. On Monday was again in that site, and the shoot growth was average 6 to 8. Today I can see the difference. And in a Cortland, I couldn't find one single fruitlet in the entire row where I was walking. So I didn't find fruit, I didn't find kin, I didn't find laterals. And the crop was starting to push with at least 4 to 6 inches of length in those shoots. So it's better what I saw today, especially in those either red, crisping, Empire, Sangela, San Honeycrisp site that I visited today. So I feel way more optimistic about what I was able to see today. That's it.
Thank you, Mario. I think we'll turn it over to Jim Eve for his perspective from his neck of the woods in Wayne County.
Thank you, Craig. I have to apologize. I've been traveling yesterday. Today just got back. I did spend a lot of all day Monday in the field and all weekend as well. And I'm seeing through the weekend at least, I was seeing a significant growth. I can't imagine that change unless there was some more fruits that aborted. So I felt generally in inland as well as at the lake, we were coming up with a fair number of fruits per tree that were going to make a respectable crop. I have talked to a number of people today, and they stopped thinning because of the heat, which in some cases has been around 90 degrees. What was really interesting to me, nighttime temperatures, I was in London, Ontario at 5 o'clock this morning, and it was 75 degrees there. I'm not sure how that translates to here. I'm seeing 65, 66, 67, but anyway, that's pretty warm for the nighttime. So there's quite a demand on the trees. It's one comment two growers made to me that phone this afternoon is that I thought the trees were flagging because of the heat, and I don't disagree with them that that's what they saw. I think I've seen that many other years too when we've been in these scenarios. But overall, I go back to the initial assessment of the numbers of bud fruitlets we had on these trees going into bloom, and spindle tree, it was probably 300 to 400 clusters. That translates to over 1,500 fruitlets. And how many of those do you want for a crop? I would suggest it's probably not much over 100. If they're all 3 1/8 inch at 90 to 100 per tree, that you wouldn't particularly object to that. So now, one thing that did appear to me on Monday, I thought the lower parts of the trees were not retaining a crop as well as I thought they were going to. The tops seem to be fine. In fact, we're doing a lot of thinning just in the tops of many of the blocks that we're in, and almost any variety. Fruit sizes I evaluated over the weekend, and I was in max, I was coming up with almost 12 millimeters in the largest fruit in a cluster of several clusters that were examined. That was Sunday, and I'm sure we probably added at least 1.5 to 2 millimeters to that as of today. Galas were similar. They were over 11 millimeters and growing extremely well. And I know there's some places where we put the second thinner on them, second application on them. And they'll be, I have little doubt they'll be a third because they were 4 and 5 in a cluster when we started. Maybe Mother Nature's going to take some of those, but we'll, I guess my feeling is we can use all the help we can get. The other varieties, Empire, at first I was kind of down on them, but I think there's going to be a reasonable crop. Again, the bottoms of the trees probably don't need a whole lot to look at. The tops, I think, need to be paid attention to. If you get a shoot or a branch up there that's got 8 or 10 fruitlets on it, and I've counted that several times, and there's probably for a crop, reasonable crop, you only want 3 of those, maybe 4 at the most. You're going to have to do something with that to clean it up. So I would pay a special attention to the variability within the tree and then in the blocks as well. One thing that I noticed on Monday, in a north sloping block, the south end was almost devoid of all blossoms. It was done with petal fall. The north end still had maybe 15 or 20% remaining, telling me that there's a couple days or more difference in the development progression from one end of the block to the other. That could be critical in some of the thinning that we may or may not do. The prospectus for other varieties, New York one it depends on the site. Overall, I thought most of them are going to need to get thinned a little bit. Empire, I've changed. I'm probably going to at least thin some tops. Ida Red need to be done. They're not setting 4 or 5 in the spur, but they are setting 2 and 3, and that has to be worked on. Max, a lot of Max are already done and seem to respond pretty well. we'll see how they end up. The jury is still out on that one yet, but I think it's going to be a pretty good couple minutes. With that, I'll leave you with those thoughts.
Greatly appreciated, Jim. Now we'll turn it over to Vaughn Gingerich from Lake Ontario Ag Consulting to give us his perspective on the orchards that he works in.
Thanks, Craig. To be honest, I think Mario and Jim really gave a really good overview of what's out there. The only thing I really think I have to add very much, like we've said, there's some relatively poor set per cluster when you are talking about empires, a fair number of Rome blocks, a fair number of Ida Reds, but similar to what Jim is seeing, when you start really looking up high in the tree, there's a lot of threes, there's a lot of fours, and even lower in the trees in a lot of those blocks. If you really start looking, you start seeing more and more twos, threes, and even some fours. So even where we have some of these blocks where they've not set real well, they're doing a lot of self-thinning, we still are going to need to go in and do some light thinning in some of these blocks to get them down to where we want them to be. The other thing I think I have to add is some clients that did some thinning last week with some pretty strong rates in a really strong negative carbohydrate balance. We are now seeing some results from that, and we definitely got some pretty strong thinning results out of some of that. That being said, some of those Gala blocks that were done at that time, we're still going to have to go back in and hit them a third time. So yeah, I guess that's all I have to add.
Thank you, Vaughn. If anybody has any questions for any of us, if you would put it into the chat box, that would be great, because in the interest of time, Terence has another meeting to get to after this one, so we will not hesitate. And welcome Terence again for giving us the meat and potatoes of the thinning recommendations.
Good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate all of the help from Mario and Craig and Liz to help me get a sense of what's going on all over the Western New York area. Let me just say that we would have suggested that people spray at the last meeting, spray last week. And we also previously suggested they spray at bloom. So it's potentially that some blocks have already been sprayed twice, and now this would be the third spray. Other blocks maybe only were sprayed last week, and now we have to decide what to do this week. But there are some blocks that were never sprayed because of the frost, and then that complicates things a lot, which I'll get into some of the specific things about the complication as we go through this presentation. The fruit growth rate model is extremely helpful. I only have one bit of data on the fruit growth rate model, thanks to Mario and Liz from Orleans County block, but it indicates that we did get substantial thinning from last week's thinning sprays. Let me talk about what's complicating the situation. This widespread frost damage gives tremendous variability in blocks on the number of fruitlets per tree, and also whether or not they have set enough of a crop to even be considered for thinning. So I'll say it now, but repeat it with more specific direction at the end, that every block has to be evaluated. Generally, we had good pollination and pretty good fruit set for what was there. The petal fall sprays that went on last week were applied under very warm conditions with a significant carbohydrate deficit. And this has given, as can't remember who just said it, some really good thinning. And in some cases, it gave enough thinning that we won't need to add any more. Probably not for Gala. Mostly what I see with Gala is it's going to need another spray, but in some Honeycrisp blocks, I've seen enough thinning out of that spray that went on last week. Now, with that sort of complicated situation, let's talk about what you would do where you do need thinning. And if we go forward and spray, this next spray, if some people spray today, it's tremendous carbohydrate deficit. you spray tomorrow, it's still a substantial deficit. We tend to like to put this spray on when we get 200 to 250 degree days, base 4 degrees C, and that's coming up. It started already for inland sites on Monday and goes through Wednesday. For more lake sites, it starts today and goes through Saturday. The very interesting and challenging part of this year is this graph and the table of the carbohydrate balance. I've looked at the carbohydrate balance, inland sites, lake sites in both Wayne County, Orleans County, and Niagara County. But for the sake of time, I'm only going to present two. I'm presenting here basically the Berber's weather station in Sodas for today. And I want you to just look at what's happened in this timing when the Petal Fall sprays went on last week. We were entering a substantial carbohydrate deficit. And if you look at the scale on the right, that's a -50 about the time Petal Fall sprays would have gone on last Thursday. It then got worse in terms of carbohydrate deficit, with deficit somewhere around -60, -65. The situation is moderated in terms of the 6-day average because tomorrow, Friday, and Saturday will be cooler without very big deficits, and in some cases just essentially a zero balance, a slight positive balance. But in the table below, I put some actual numbers, and this is one of the things I want to highlight. Yesterday and today, reasons that we can sometimes explain, the carbohydrate model predicts tremendous deficits of -98 and -94. They were preceded by substantial deficits in the 30s to 40s. But those 2 days by themselves constitute a climatic event that will cause thinning. So with what we've had yesterday and today, we've had the equivalent of a thinning spray put on our trees naturally from the carbohydrate deficit. And there will be fruits that will drop off because of those 2 days of -98 and today of -94. You have to take that into account when you thin. If you thin last Thursday, you got substantial thinning from that. And then these 2 days yesterday.
All right, I'll be there in a minute.
Will give us a natural additional thinning. If you look over on the right column, you see that this is for close to the lake in Wayne County. They entered the window of between 200 and 250, basically today, and it goes through Friday or Saturday. So any of those days are days to thin once we decide how much thinning we want to do, both based on the fruit set and what we had from the frost, but also from this substantial deficit we've just been living in the last 2 days. I picked only the inland site in Orleans County, Medina. The lake site, very similar. They didn't have quite as negative of a deficit over there for some reason. So if you look on the bottom chart, we had them yesterday a -62 and today a predicted -71. Those are still below my threshold of -60 when it's dangerous to thin, but not quite as bad as what we got in Wayne County. And that's really surprising that even close to the lake at Ferber's, we were getting this. By the way, for those of you in Wayne County, I also checked over at DeMarie's, essentially the same story in the -90s. So with those climatic events, let's talk about what we can expect and what we could potentially do. Now, we're right in the time where over many, many years, thinning studies that we've done have shown is the moment when thinners have their strongest effect on the tree and are most potent. Now, that's good on one hand, but on the other hand, it's more risky. Sprays that go on in this week, yesterday, today, tomorrow, Friday, Saturday. Carbohydrate model is extremely beneficial here because of this sort of rule of thumb I've sort of worked with for now 10 years. whenever sort of the average carbohydrate deficit is less than -60, you probably should not spray. We've had that in the last 2 days. And so, we picked this meeting time a few days ago. We probably should have had it a few days earlier, but I hope people did not spray yesterday or today. The carbohydrate model indicates that we're currently in this very severe deficit, but that will be followed over the next 3 to 4 days with a much milder carbohydrate deficit. Now that means that sprays applied tomorrow, Friday, Saturday will give very good thinning, but not high risk of over thinning. Now, there is some risk of over thinning this year because this severe deficits we've been through have given us a natural thinning event. So if you sprayed last Thursday, that thinner was working in the tree Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. And then we've coupled that with the very dramatic deficits on Tuesday and Wednesday, which essentially prolonged that thinning, so that there's a substantial thinning back to back with chemical and environment. Now, if we come in tomorrow with any thinners, we're just going to continue that. Also, wherever we've had significant frost damage, there's a risk of over thinning. Now, I run the risk in trying to speak the way I am that will make everybody afraid to thin. But it is the reality that we are now in the 12, 13 millimeter range. We're running out of days when we can get thinning. And if you need thinning, I don't think you can back off. And I think there's a window tomorrow, Friday, and Saturday to put thinners on. But because the deficits are moderating, the 6-day average is much less scary. I don't think there's a huge risk of over thinning. Now, what options do you have? I think this year, it's a great year to put Maxell on Gala. Now, Craig's report of Gala, which I'll show in just a minute, a summary of what he said, was very troubling to me because so far, all the Galas that I have seen are just loaded. But I haven't seen as many frost-damaged orchards or Gala blocks that maybe did not return bloom. But he had several different Gala blocks out of the 8 or 9 that he looked at that were not that great. But in general, I think Galas will need a substantial spray in the next 3 days. And I suggest a full dose, 64 ounces on a tree row volume basis, which is basically works out to a gallon to the acre. I'll show you in the next slide, plus Carbro. I would be surprised if there's very many Gala blocks that don't need this substantial spray in the next 3 days. Honeycrisp, as was mentioned, seemed to come through the frost fairly well. Honeycrisp responded to the sprays put on last week with substantial thinning and substantial flagging, and I'll show some data from Orcharddale in just a minute. But if you didn't go forward with that spray last week, you'd have to spray Honeycrisp this week with 3 ounces of NA plus a pint of 7. Now, the earlier Petal fall spray, I like 4 ounces, but at this timing, because the trees are at their most sensitive stage to thinners, I never want to go above 3 ounces on a tree row volume dilute basis for Honeycrisp. With McIntosh, it's interesting that it also came through the frost fairly well, and it responds very well to just 2 ounces of NAA and a pint of 7. I was very interested to hear Jim's comments about Empire, that he's more positive about what it looks like. I think Empire will respond extremely well to Maxell and 7 for fruit size improvement. Here, if there's a situation where you lost the kings and you're down to just 2 laterals, I would probably reduce that rate to 48 ounces. But if you've got 3 fruitlets growing, I would stick with the 64 ounces of Maxell. I left this Spur Delicious in there, the slide which I'd prepared before I saw the data from Mario and Craig, but it doesn't sound like there's hardly any Delicious blocks that are going to need thinning. Now, Fuji is the weird one because they're blocks with essentially no crop, as Craig describes, and blocks with a fantastic crop. Fuji needs this high rate of Maxell and a pint of 7 to get repeat bloom. And that's what I'd suggest where you have a crop. Now I'll go through just my normal help to help you calculate how much goes in the tank. Each of those recommendations I gave on the previous slide was what I call a tree row volume dilute recommendation. But to calculate then how much goes in the tank, we first have to calculate tree row volume for the orchard, and then compare that to the amount of water we're carrying in the sprayer to come up with what we call a concentration factor. So the tree row volume in gallons per acre divided by the volume of spray we actually are putting on gives a concentration factor. For example, on a 200-gallon dilute block, we only spray 100 gallons. In that case, the concentration factor is 2. So you take the suggested rates that I have, and I gave 2. That's used the Honeycrisp one at 3 ounces of NAA, or the Gala one at 64 ounces of Maxell. You would take that rate, multiply it by the concentration factor of 2, which would give 6 ounces of NAA per 100 gallons, or a full gallon of Maxell per 100 gallons. And then you just multiply it by the number of 100 gallons in your sprayer. So with NAA, it's a 500-gallon sprayer, we'd end up with about 30 ounces in the spray tank. I do this for 2 reasons. Every year there's huge mistakes made with NAA, either way too little or way too much. You got to be thinking somewhere where you need thinning in about the 30, 35, maybe up to 40 ounces in a spray tank. But if you're putting in 10 ounces, you're not going to get anything. Similarly with Maxell, you have to be thinking in the neighborhood of 1 gallon in every 100 or 5 gallons in a spray tank. Now, one other suggestion I have is that I don't generally like to put double the 7 in, so just put the pint of 7 for every 100, so that'd be 5 pints in a sprayer. Now, as I look at the predicted forecast and the carbohydrate model, I think the best timing is basically now. For inland sites, it started on Tuesday, but it was extremely hot on Tuesday and extremely hot today on Wednesday, so I hope people didn't spray. But there's really only one more day left for inland sites, and that's tomorrow. So I think everybody inland has to be going tomorrow. The lake sites have a little more play that starts today and goes through Saturday, so you can pick your day, Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. To me, it looks like Thursday's the safest day after the heat's passed. High temperatures will still be pretty good in the upper 70s. There will be a mild carbohydrate deficit, which will give good thinning results. And so it would be a day to use full rates on those blocks where you've got a really nice crop. I do want to caution that Honeycrisp responded extremely well to petal fall sprays last week with the warm weather and then the heat we've had Tuesday and Wednesday. And so they may not need additional sprays, but this is where you've got to make a judgment and you got to go out and really look. I wish each of you were measuring fruit diameters and could tell me how many Honeycrisp fruitlets are still growing. But no, I know of only one set of data, which I'll show in just a minute. But I think almost everybody who has Gala is going to need to put on this spray tomorrow, Friday, or Saturday. This is the one piece of data we have on fruit growth rate model. This is with Honeycrisp in Orleans County at Orcharddale. And in this particular block, they had about 169 clusters or spurs that were flowering per tree. So you multiply that by 5, and you can see at the top of the chart, this small little blue line, there should have been around an average of 850 fruits on those trees. The thinning that's been done so far has reduced that considerably down to 211 fruits. So there's a substantial amount of thinning achieved. Now, if we wanted to get to 100, we certainly aren't there yet. We've still got 100 extra fruits on the tree. But the challenge is that the heat yesterday and today is going to give additional thinning, which probably is not represented in these measurements. So this is where I think with Honeycrisp, it's worth trying to sit back and think and evaluate whether we want to spray right away, if we sprayed last Thursday or Friday, or whether we wait a couple of days and see a little better what's happening. The problem that we repeatedly said in these meetings is you have to assess each block. Are the kings present? If they are, you probably should use a full rate. But if kings are missing and we're down to relatively 1 or 2 laterals, then it takes more finesse. I extracted from the data that Craig gathered the last couple of days this chart that he prepared, showing of all the gala blocks that he visited, how he would rate them on a scale of 0 to 5. So a 4 and 5 would be worthy of thinning. So if you look at the gala blocks, there's a lot of 4s and 5s, but there's at least 3 or 4 blocks that are 1s or 2s, which is what I could not quite understand, Craig, but it's really shocking because every gala block I've looked at needs a lot of thinning. But on Honeycrisp, you can see that almost all the blocks have a very nice crop but still need additional thinning. And then each of the varieties, when you look down, you can see how variable the results are. You go down to any of the varieties and you'll see that there really is some blocks like Evercrisp, essentially no crop, and then another block had an average or pretty decent crop. So it's critical that you assess each block and then make your decision based upon the level of crop that is there. I will remind you, you will not be able to see today the results of the heat wave that we're just living. You won't see that visibly for at least 6 to 7 more days. And by that time, we'll be out of this thinning window and we'll be in relatively large fruit sizes. That's why measuring fruits is so valuable. But without that, it's going to be a challenge for you to be able to think through exactly how aggressive to be on the thinning. Now, if necessary, point number 2, and then point number 2 of that, if we just don't get the thinning we need, we could still try again next week about this time. Now, generally, we like to nozzle the sprayer with more in the top than in the bottom, but particularly this year with frost and then with already some of the bottoms thinning out quite a bit, I suggest you spray 75% of all the spray to the top half of the tree. If you come back next week for another spray, only spray the top of the tree. You'll get a much better response if you put very little into the bottom half of the tree. Now, the last point here is that some years regulate is very helpful when we have a carbohydrate surplus or no deficit, but that's not this year. So I would not add regulate to the thinners this year. I end with this one again, saying that we're right down at this 3rd point in this chart. Honeycrisp needs this NaN7 now, accepting where we got a fabulous response from the Petal Fall spray. But regardless, starting late next week, we've got to start in with a series of ethereal sprays to get repeat bloom. So I know that this presentation has been a little bit vague in the sense that I haven't given you everybody go out and spray, but I do want to end with just 2 generalized statements. If you judge your block to need thinning, I think tomorrow's the day. Go out and thin. For Gala, typically it would be a full rate, and for Honeycrisp it would be a full rate. For Red Delicious, probably no thinning. For Max, you're going to need just modest rate. Cortland's no thinning, where we had all this damage. But I think hopefully most of the Western New York people will go and do something tomorrow on the blocks that still need it. So with that, Craig, I'm going to stop and be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Terence. Questions for Terence or any of the speakers from this afternoon? You can unmute yourself or you can throw it in the chat box. Let folks know I didn't talk about stone fruit and pears. Visited a few blocks, so I put the information in the chat box there. Any comment to the efficacy of carbol alone on Gala?
It's like drinking water. If you don't have NAA with it or Maxell with it, you get almost nothing on strong Gala sets.
Anything else, folks? Anybody want to share something, anything that they've seen different from what we've reported on? You certainly are not in every block.
Terence, why ROMs were so poor, sad, or low sad? They were not growing today in what I saw. Do you have any idea?
Well, that's a really strange observation because they were way behind at the time of the
Yes.
frost. They
Yes.
should have come through that frost wonderfully. And then we had decent pollination weather during Rome bloom. So we should have had a fairly decent crop on Romes.
I heard they were okay for the most part. Maybe it's just a few
I'm
blocks.
not sure exactly what you saw, but
If Jim or Vaughn want to comment, I talked to one grower who liked this, says Romes were good.
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of variation out there. There are good blocks. Rome Beauties, I think, came through better than Taylor Romes and Law Romes. I see quite a number of Taylor and Law Rome blocks that do not have a good set.
Okay, that's yeah, because I don't have
Thanks.
anything. I don't have anything in the blog that I have been following. Okay. Why Cortland was so bad, Terence? Why Cortland was so bad? I can't understand that thing.
Or Red Delicious.
well,
In spots.
Red Delicious is known to be frost
Yeah, Red
sensitive.
Delicious, yeah,
It has that reputation forever. But Cortland was just caught at the perfect stage of flower development in those frosts. And it just was much more sensitive right at that moment. It's not typical that we lose Cortlands to frost, but wow, it sure showed up this year.
One comment on some Romes, several of the blocks that I work with, there's not that many anymore, are were poor in wreath flower from last year. I think some of them are going to make a crop, but we're not worried about them at the moment.
Thanks,
I'll
Jim.
just add a comment to that it's odd that some galas did not return bloom. But I attribute that also to many of the varieties had trouble with return bloom, to the fact that thinners didn't work very well last year, and we just carried way too many apples on some gala blocks. And gala normally can overcome that and come back with a good bloom, but in some cases they just did not this year.
Yeah, two of the growers I talked to, one, the fruit, it was a block that I was working in. It was overcropped and there was a lot of small fruit in there. So the block was probably stressed. And the other one, they said it was a heavy crop and just think it didn't come back.
Mm-hmm.
Terence, now that we have two growers here, I would like to suggest we measure fruitlet on Friday and Monday, and we have the next meeting on Tuesday next week instead of Wednesday. If we, do you think that's a good strategy?
No, it's absolutely
a little
really
late.
good. It would be a really great strategy. And I'll just comment that this experience happened to us in the Hudson Valley 2 years ago. I can't remember which, where we had a heat wave right after or right before thinners went on. And so people were measuring fruitlet diameters and they got the results from the thinner, just like this year from last Thursday or Friday. But the heat wave took additional fruits off. And then they went ahead and thinned based upon what the fruit diameter measurements were on the fruit growth rate model, not knowing that the heat by itself was taking off apples and then over thinned. So what we will see if we do take measurements again on Friday is a big difference between today's measurements and Friday's measurements, because we'll start to pick up the natural thinning that came from the heat wave. And then a Monday measurement will pick it up too, even if no thinner was put on.
Okay.
Good to know.
I would like to let the grower know that perhaps next meeting is gonna be Tuesday instead of Wednesday. So we're not so late like today. We're with the heat.
I know there's some other growers out there taking fruit diameter measurements, and so if
Yes.
you could try to do what I just suggested, to take other measurements on Friday and Monday, we'll pick up what this heat did naturally.
Yeah, we're gonna be calling growers to get that data. Okay.
I have 5 o'clock and greatly appreciate all the speakers today. Terence, I know you have another thinning meeting to get to, so I'll let you go. And thank you, everybody, for your participation. Greatly appreciated. Again, we'll have this on a YouTube channel sometime, most likely tomorrow morning. I'll send it out in an email blast early tomorrow morning, and you can also find it on a YouTube channel as well if you're not enrolled in our program. So with that,
And also thank you to Vaughn and Jim, and
Yeah.
hopefully you can have them next week also. Thank you so
greatly
much.
appreciated.